Hi guys, I am so excited to sing to you a song called Giant George. And it's a song we wrote together even though we're just meeting now. But I know your teacher shared a song called Akin Drum. And then you wrote these ideas and suggestions. And I've got to tell you, there were so many great suggestions. I have some of them written here. And they're actually going to go into two songs. So the first one is about a guy named Giant George. And he doesn't live in the moon like Akin Drum. He stomps around your garden. Now this song has a trick at the end, so if you pay attention, you'll be able to kind of master this. There was a guy in the garden, garden. There was a guy in the garden. His name was Giant George, and his head was made of potato chips, potato chips, potato chips. His head was made of potato chips, and his name was Giant George. And his eyes were made of cherries, cherries, cherries. His eyes were made of cherries, that old Giant George. His ears were made of cauliflower, cauliflower, cauliflower. His ears were made of cauliflower, dear old Giant George. Oh, his mouth was a banana, banana, banana. His mouth was a banana, our friend old Giant George. Oh, I love his hair, guys. Good suggestion. His hair was made of noodles, noodles, noodles. His hair was made of noodles, dear old Giant George. What do you think his body was made of? There were a lot of good ideas. I decided it's going to be his body was a potato, potato, potato. His body was a potato, our dear old Giant George. And his hands were made of zucchini, zucchini, zucchini. His hands were made of zucchini. His name was Giant George. Oh, his feet were also vegetables. They were eggplant, eggplant, eggplant. His feet were made of eggplant, our dear old Giant George. And he stomped about the garden, garden, garden. He stomped around our garden, dear old Giant George. Ah, here's the trick, guys. Were you paying attention? I'm going to sing what it is, and I'm going to sing what body part it is, and you got to fill in what you created. Well, his head was made of his head was made of potato chips. His name was Akin Drum, and his eyes were made of. Did you get that one? His eyes were made of cherries, dear old Giant George. His ears were made of. His ears were made of cauliflower, dear old Giant George. And his hair was made of. His hair was made of noodles, dear old Giant George. His body was a potato. His body was a potato, dear old Giant George. And his hands were made of. The hands were made of zucchini, and his name was Giant George. And his feet were made of eggplants. His feet were made of eggplants, dear old Giant George. And he stomped around the garden, garden, garden. He stomped around the garden, our dear old Giant George. Bravo, songwriters.